India and China are the world's most populous countries, but they're also among the fastest growing economies in the world. How then can multinationals tap into that phenomenal growth? With us now are Anil Gupta, Professor of Strategy at Maryland University in the US, and Haiyan Wang, a Managing Partner of research consulting organization China-India Institute. Now, you have co-authored a book, Getting China and India Right. How can you get China and India right?
The way we come at this question is to say that China and India are the only two countries in the world where four compelling realities are playing out and playing out simultaneously. Any one of the four would be profoundly important for the strategy of any multinational corporation. But the interesting part is that all four are playing out at the same time. Story number one is mega markets, mega growth. But of course, given the vast populations with very low buying powers at the individual per capita income level. Second story is platforms for cost efficiency by material amounts on a global basis for blue collar as well as white collar work. Story number three as platforms for innovation. By innovation, global innovation, to an extent that it is materially important for competitive advantage, driven both by the talent, the scalability and the cost of that talent in China and India, but also driven by opportunities for business model innovation, driven by the unique needs of these markets, which drives innovation, but that innovation is globally relevant, globally fungible. And the story number four is China and India as the springboards for the rise of a new breed of competitors that are very capable and highly ambitious and fast-moving.
Well, one of the interesting things about your book is that you're saying that multinationals should be targeting both India and China and not an either-or situation. Why do you think that?
There are several reasons why we say that. So I take a few of the most important ones. Number one is that both of these are, as you said, the two most populous markets. They are mega markets. They are two of the 12 largest economies in the world, which means that a company that targets both markets can actually have scale, compensate for margins, which means that you can be more competitive if you're operating in both markets, particularly if you're operating in the mass market where you bring ultra low cost products and services. So that's number one, leveraging for scale. The second is that China and India, certainly in the current time frame, have complementarities. China is much stronger than India in manufacturing. India is much stronger than China in IT software services. But there are other types of complementarities. So for example, India certainly has an advantage in English language relative to China. But at the same time, India is a very creative country. And so the global advertising industry in many ways is now converging into India, which is becoming a major global platform for the creation of advertising. So much so that Lenovo had its global marketing center in Bangalore. So that's another opportunity. So that's one, leveraging complementarities. So one is scale, second is leveraging complementarities. A third is that by operating in both markets, the multinational company can essentially use diversification to reduce the risks. There are political risks, economic risks. So you don't, let's say, take R&D, for example. If you concentrate a major R&D program in one country, as versus disaggregating one part in China, another part in India, clearly you reduce IP risks, for example. Similarly, you reduce political risks and other types of risks. So these are three of the major reasons. Added on top of that, or maybe as an overlay on top of that, is what most people don't realize is that economic integration between China and India in terms of the development of bilateral economic linkages is one of the most powerful story playing out today among the top 12 economies. So like China-India trade today is $52 billion, meaning 2008 figures. And if it grows over the next 12 years at even half the rate that it has grown over the last 10, China-India bilateral trade in 2020 could be larger than China-US trade today.
But a lot of companies found it very difficult to even get into the China market and basically tap that market alone. Isn't it somewhat dangerous to spread things a bit too thinly?
That's a fair point. And so if we are talking about a company that is relatively new to the globalization game and that is relatively new to Asia, to China and India, then we would indeed say, do not take on both domains of complexity at the same time. Pick one. And maybe even in picking China or India, don't necessarily pick on all four, the market opportunity, the cost opportunity, the innovation opportunity, and so on at the same time. Kind of go start in a focused manner. But the moment we start talking about, say, a Fortune 1000 company, then for a company that large, which is almost certainly not new to the globalization game, then the issue of debating, the days of debating whether China or India are over. You really have to be in both.
To add to the point about the importance of thinking of China and India, not China or India, this relevance for multinational companies is relevant for existing Western multinational companies, but it's also very relevant for the emerging multinational companies, the Chinese companies, the Indian companies. They are still not quite aware of the mega opportunities and the importance of thinking about both China and India. In the case for Indian companies, in the Tata Consulting Services, the auto companies, and the engineering companies, what kind of market opportunity they must take advantage of in China, and so is the case for Chinese companies, from power plant to construction companies to equipment companies. Because if they are not thinking in that direction, the existing multinational companies would have an advantage of having footholds in both and leveraging the scale, leveraging the complementarities, and give the Chinese companies and Indian companies a hard play down the road.
We have seen Chinese companies start to look outwards, start to think global, but only in a sort of embryonic way.
Yes.
We've seen Lenovo with the PC operations of IBM, but there are a lot of question marks still over that. So how do you see things playing out?
I think that from a long-term perspective, if you look at by the year of 2020, the number of Chinese companies in the global Fortune 500 would definitely be increasing multiple fold for sure. But they face a lot of challenges in several fronts. One is the capability in financially. Traditionally, Chinese companies have easy access to capital. So how to manage capital, how to protect and enhance shareholder value is definitely something they have to learn. One, financial skills. Second is the organizational management skills. Chinese managers tend to be very good with managing in a hierarchical way, command and control. But when you have operations globally and managing people with different cultures, different backgrounds, and then that horizontal management skills is a huge, huge challenge. Plus the English capabilities. How do you communicate to your external shareholders, to your internal employees? Huge challenge. The third challenge is Chinese companies tend to be good at competing through costs, through cost efficiencies, through low cost. But as soon as you go out, you have to be able to compete on differentiation. And that's a new game that they have to be better at. And the third is overall overcoming the political sensitivity, the barriers. Because these Chinese companies, most of them going global, are state-owned enterprises. So the political pressure is immense. So they have to be good at managing the image. So playing this PR and marketing games to win the hearts of the consumers and win hearts of politicians is a huge challenge. But despite of this challenge, the long-term perspectives of more and more emerging giants from China is for sure. And plus you have the strong push from the central government to make Chinese companies global champions. You have the easy access to capital, which they could utilize to their benefits, plus the scale and the economies of scale, the low cost efficiencies. So these are some of the strengths they need to bring, and plus enhance their capabilities in other aspects.
At the moment, though, the name of the game is really low cost innovation. As you say, I think you term it as frugal innovation in your book. How long is it going to be before we see this switch to value added within China, that companies are moving upscale?
The way we interpret frugal innovation, or the way we define frugal innovation, actually is not so much a defeaturing story or leveraging the low labor costs in China or India. And that's why we say not just merely low-cost products, but we use the term frugal innovation, because what we are talking about is that, according to several studies, 70% of the costs are essentially built into the design of the product or design of the service. So therefore, frugal innovation, of course, a very widely reported example of that would be Tata Nano, that it starts at the point of design, certainly the design of the product and the service, because what frugal innovation means is that it's really for the customer, by the customer, that you need to understand exactly who the customer is, and that's the middle income customer with very low buying power. What is it that they value, but also what is it that they do not value, and you build in those things. Now it may require a higher degree of sturdiness, a higher degree of reliability, but it may not require plush comforts. It may not require 0 to 60 in 10 seconds kind of thing. So, and those are all design issues, and they require, in fact, working across the entire value chain, bringing in suppliers, bringing in, if you have dealers in the stage of designing the business model, designing the product or service. Take the case of Tata Nano, that tires. Now, of course, you need low-cost tires, but the last thing you want in a Tata Nano are tires that fail, because that would completely destroy. So you want tires that are low cost, but at the same time that are in fact very reliable. Now, that is not a defeaturing game, but because what it requires for the tire company is to rethink what raw materials go into, how do you design the tread. And so that's what we mean by is innovation that leads to ultra low cost products and services. And that's something, the beauty of frugal innovation is that much of the innovation, the features, the technology, the business models, they may actually be fungible up and down in the food chain, that you could take the innovation that originated in, say, China or India, but take it global.
You mentioned IP earlier, and staying with that subject, there is the concern about intellectual property and property rights, that you'll take your product into China and it'll be copied and it'll end up being mass marketed even before you've managed to start selling it within the country. And I think you've been quoted as saying that that's a cop-out, that the fact that companies are saying that. But isn't it, though, a valid argument on the part of these companies?
Yeah, I think that to some extent it is still a major threat, because China's intellectual property laws, though have been improving over the years, but it's still relatively in a newer stage as compared to the Western countries. And a lot of times the execution of the existing intellectual property laws still need to be improved, because China is such a large country, and at the local levels, to be able to prevent the copycats from copy and violating intellectual property rights, it's still a major challenge. But I would say to Western multinational companies, and anybody who wants to come to China to do business, is to not let that concern be a psychological barrier. And because if you wait 5 years, 10 years from today, wait for that environment to be perfect, then it would be too late. And Chinese government is pushing very hard to create a better intellectual property protection environment, because that's not just for the benefits of the multinational companies, that's also for the benefits of the Chinese companies such as Huawei Technologies, that they are innovating, because they are playing the global games. Because without such a good environment, you will find that the leading Chinese companies will run into trouble of how do they become more innovative if they are concerned about their profits being eroded immediately after they put in R&D investment.
And in fact, just compliment what Haiyan said on the intellectual property issue, is that in some ways I see a parallel between what's happening in China for the moment, where IP risks are deemed on average to be higher than in India. I see an analogy between, not on the legal front, but in terms of on-the-ground reality, between, say, China and Silicon Valley. Now, if we take the US and we take the technology industries, technology-intensive industries in the US, where are the biggest IP risks? The biggest IP risks are in Silicon Valley, because people, they have social connections and they leave one company and join another company and so on, etc. But so, IP leakage is part and parcel of what we would say any innovation ecosystem. And so to the end, but companies know that because there is high risk of IP leakage in Silicon Valley, doesn't mean that you stay away from Silicon Valley, but what it means is that you need to be very smart. Maybe you don't necessarily patent everything, and you essentially keep it as a trade secret. And you figure out ways and means of, let's say, disaggregating your technology projects, so that not everything is concentrated in one lab, so that, if somebody walks out, they know something important, but they don't know the whole package, and so on. So there are ways and means that companies are learning about how to do R&D work, leading edge R&D work in China, tap into the talent, tap into the incentives given by the government, tap into the uniqueness of the market reality, which cultivates certain types of innovation, but at the same time to minimize the risks of IP leakage.
So meaning that, for example, if you have key R&D activities, and instead of concentrating them all in one location, you parcel them. So when you copy, you only copy part of it, but not the whole R&D, as a way of protecting against that potential risk. And I found that that companies also try to make their leading products a little bit more affordable for the mass market. So you take away the incentives so that your products can be quickly made available, not only to the top-notch market segment, but also to the mass market. So your brand, your presence in the mass market is such that it leaves no room for the copycats to catch up.
That's exactly what Microsoft has realized, is that if your Windows product or Microsoft Office in China is going to be priced anything like what you price in the US or Europe, essentially the market demand is so high, and the potential for arbitrage, between piracy and buying the genuine product is so large that you are going to be totally exposed to IP leakage, to software piracy. But if you bring the price point down dramatically, you reduce the incentive. In some ways, you look at what iPhone or Apple has done in the music business in the US, because in the US itself, piracy in music is extremely high. You're talking maybe in the 46%, 50%. But if you come up with the right kind of product, right kind of pricing, you can bring the piracy down significantly.
In your book, you make an interesting point that something like 9 out of 10 companies, multinationals going to China, don't really approach it correctly. That instead of looking at the market needs, they're more concerned with products and how they can sell them.
One of the executives that we interviewed as part of our research put it in a very crisp manner, and which kind of on the face of it is quite a shocking statement, but it captures the reality very accurately. And he is the China chairman of one of the largest companies in the world. He's Chinese himself, and clearly he understands China and he understands the world of multinationals. And he said, mark my words, in 10 years, there will be fewer successful multinational companies in China than there are today. And I say, you kind of sit back and say, well, companies ought to be learning and they ought to be more deeply engaged. So therefore, why should there be fewer successful companies? And what his point was, that actually, as he went on to elaborate, is that companies are focusing, the vast majority of companies, Western multinationals, are focusing on the top tier of the market, whether it is B2C or B2B. And so they still see double-digit growth. So therefore, the local country head can still report nice figures back home. But what they don't realize is that actually their market share is shrinking, and they're being backed into a corner because there is this vast middle market. And just like what Toyota did, that it didn't enter the US with a Lexus, it entered with low-priced cars, very good cars, but still, they were for the mass market, and then they moved up. And as one of the executives said, that it's easier for a poor man to learn how to become rich, harder for a rich man to learn how to act poor. And so therefore, in this race over time, companies that occupy the middle will probably have an easier time to move up to the premium end as compared to companies that stay at the premium end to go down to the mass market. And over the next 15 years, 500 million people, more people, in China will join the ranks of the middle class. 500 million people in India will join the ranks of the middle class. So that's where the big growth is. And a lot of multinationals are not focused on that. That's what we mean by saying that 9 out of 10 companies don't really, haven't thought through what this new market reality is adequately.
Isn't it understandable, though, that if you're going into China, you would target the main cities? You would target Shanghai, Guangzhou, Beijing. You wouldn't go for the rural areas. The Chinese companies are already targeting the rural areas and moving up to the second-tier cities.
It's understandable. But what we say is that, it's like there is a beachhead where you start. But a beachhead ought to be looked at exactly what it is. It's a beachhead. A beachhead is not the destination. And so there, yes, you start in Shanghai or Beijing or Guangzhou. But you see, if we take the top 25 cities in China, so you're going well beyond Shanghai, Beijing, and Guangzhou, the top 25 cities in China is still less than 10% of China's population. And so so that's a good starting point. But very rapidly, starting on that beachhead, unless of course you're a Porsche or a Ferrari or a Louis Vuitton, then it's a different story because you're just playing a niche game. But if you're a Toyota or IBM or GE or Procter & Gamble or Yum Brands and so on, or Nokia, then you need to be thinking about that, okay, this is our beachhead, but then how do we migrate from here to where the real story is?
And if you look at the competition of Nokia versus Motorola, Nokia, the reason why Nokia is so successful is precisely because Nokia can pursue a multi-segment strategy. So in the up times and down times, they can target all of the channels in the market. That gives them the market advantages. And in Procter & Gamble, the same thing. And they have the top-end products, they have the mass market, mid-end product, and they have the low-end products, the whole spectrum. That's all of these products do not have to be under the same brand. They can be multi-segment, multi-brand. And from a medium, long-term perspective, that's the way that companies should be doing.
You're expecting China to become the world's largest economy. I mean, at the moment it's still very diverse within China. There's still a lot of poverty in the rural areas. You're still expecting reasonably fast growth within the country. However, you're also expecting exports to start to slow. I think at the moment it's 25% per annum for exports, so you're expecting that to decline to 10%. So how do you expect China to grow in the future? Will it develop its domestic market more?
China will have to. We think that the days of 20-25% growth in export is over, because if China continues that 20-25% annual growth, by 2020, China's share of the world's export would go from currently 10% to almost 50%, and no other country is going to let that happen. So domestic-driven growth will have to happen. That could be domestic investment plus domestic consumption. Already you are seeing that domestic consumption is picking up. Even in 2008, in 2009, in a lot of categories, for example, retail sales has been growing at 20% a year. Auto sales has been growing at 20-25% a year, and mobile phones and internet services and education and hospital, healthcare, and insurance. You look at all of these industries and the growth has been double digits. Plus, I think some of the policies that the Chinese government is putting in place is right on in terms of pumping up the domestic consumption. For example, building the rural infrastructure, making the goods to flow more easily from the cities to the rural areas, and for rural areas to move their goods more easily to cities so that the farmers could earn more incomes, and that income goes straight into buying the home appliances, that first car, first motorcycle. And as China continues the policy of pursuing balanced development, sustainable development, and that all goes into pumping up the domestic consumption.
Well, we've seen through the domestic market in China that it's managed to stay fairly insulated from the global recession. Do you think the recession is going to accelerate the processes that we've seen previously and that are talked about in your book, that that will help to spur China's growth and India's growth?
Yes, and in fact, I mean, in the case of China, to pick up from what Haiyan was saying, is because for China, exports have played a more important role than in the case of India. That if we start from the assumption, and in our mind that's not an assumption, that's a given reality that will unfold, is that the days of 20 to 25% sustained growth, annual growth in exports, those are gone. I mean, they're just gone forever for China. Which means that of China's, let's say, 10-11% annualized growth rate over the last 10 plus years, about 2.5% of that, 2.5 to 3%, has come from export growth. And so that 2.5 to 3% coming from export growth will come down to less than 1%. What that means is that if we assume this export story to change in this particular manner, China's growth rate over the next 5 years, over the next 10 years, will be slower than what it has been over the last 10 years. However, at the same time, for obvious reasons, it puts pressure on the political leaders that because there is no way that they can figure out a solution to the decline in export growth. So therefore, it puts increased pressure on boosting domestic consumption, which I think is good for China. It's certainly good for the rural masses in China, and it's also actually good for the global economy for China to become more domestic consumption focused.
The recession actually provides such an opportunity for China and India to close the gaps with the Western countries at a much faster pace. We actually think that we are standing right now at the strategic inflection point where China and India from here onwards is entering into a much faster chase in closing the gap. And conservatively estimate, if we think that China is going to grow at just not 8%, just 6%, and assuming that the US over the next 10 years will grow at the average of 2%, and the Chinese renminbi appreciate at about 4% reasonably, and by 2025, China's GDP could catch up with that of the US. And this is not exaggerated or outstretched estimate. So the shift of the gravity of the centers of gravity to China and to India is very real.
We're already seeing market caps of, say, the top banks in the world. I think 4 of the top 10 are now Chinese. So this is presumably a process that's going to continue and will allow Chinese companies to start acquiring overseas.
For example, as of 2008, the total of the total of Chinese and Indian companies in the global Fortune 500 list added up to about 36, right? And we could well see approaching about 100 companies could very well be in a Fortune Global 500 list by 2020.
Haiyan Wang and Anil Gupta, thanks for joining us on INSEAD Knowledge.
Thank you.